Officer Valerie thought she was in control until the man she pushed turned out to be her new boss. But instead of fighting back, he watched and waited. Why would a police chief let injustice play out this long? If that question gives you chills like this video, share it with someone who values dignity and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories. Now let's go back to that courtroom. It was a slow, tense morning inside Ashmore County Courthouse, the kind where the air felt heavy and no one smiled too wide. Civil hearings weren't usually this crowded, but today the benches were full, neighbors, activists, even a few local reporters. All eyes were on the woman sitting calmly at the defense table, Officer Valerie Kincaid. White, blonde, decorated, accused. Across from her sat a black mother gripping a worn purse with both hands. Her son, just 14, wasn't in court today. He was still recovering from a broken wrist, a swollen eye, and bruises that stretched from his ribs down to his thigh. He'd been walking home from the gas station with a cold soda. Valerie said he tried to steal it, said he lunged at her, said she had no choice but to strike first. But the store's security footage, though conveniently incomplete, showed the boy walking out calmly. Witnesses, black neighbors, mostly said he was polite, soft-spoken, that he offered to pay, that Valerie didn't give him the chance. Judge Grayson, old and pale, sat slouched behind his bench like he'd rather be anywhere else. He had the air of a man who'd seen too many courtrooms, or maybe not enough of the right kind. He didn't look at the mother when she spoke, didn't ask Valerie a single hard question. His voice was quiet, but it cut like glass when he snapped at the plaintiff's attorney for making a scene. The mood in the room shifted when the side door creaked open. A man entered slowly, his steps unhurried as though he knew precisely where he needed to be and why. He wore a plain gray coat. His shoes were polished but quiet. He carried nothing, no briefcase, no file folder, just his presence. He didn't glance at the press or the judge or Valerie. Instead, he scanned the room, once took a seat near the back, and folded his hands in his lap. No one whispered about him. No one seemed to recognize him. But the mother did glance his way, just once, like she sensed something. Valerie, still all poise and steel, leaned into her lawyer and chuckled low enough to seem casual. Her attorney didn't smile. The court clerk announced the session back in order. The mother was called to the stand. She spoke with a trembling voice, trying not to cry. She described how her son came home that day bloodied and terrified, still clutching the crushed soda can. Said she begged him to tell her what happened, and he kept saying, "I didn't do anything, Mama. I swear I didn't." Valerie never looked up while the woman spoke. Then came the boy's pediatrician, listing the injuries in clinical terms. Nothing life-threatening but extensive trauma. Defensive wounds, swelling on the left side of his head. Judge Grayson didn't blink. Just asked how long the boy had been in physical therapy and whether he'd be missing school long-term. The man in gray didn't move, not once, but his eyes, sharp and quiet, stayed locked on Valerie the entire time. The defense called a witness, another officer who'd been on patrol that day. He testified that Valerie had radioed in a possible suspect matching the boy's description, that he arrived after the incident, that he trusted her judgment. The plaintiff's lawyer pushed gently, but the judge kept interrupting. "Move on," he barked. "This isn't a criminal case." And yet in every breath, it felt like one. Valerie took the stand last, calm as ever. She recited her diversion like she'd practiced it 100 times. The boy had acted erratically. He lunged. She feared for her safety. She did what she had to do. She smiled faintly when she said it. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet. The mother looked down at her lap. The spectators stared ahead, their eyes a mix of disbelief and weary familiarity. Then the man in gray uncrossed his legs. It was a small movement, but it made Valerie glance toward him for the first time. Their eyes met, just for a second. She looked away. No one spoke to him. No one asked why he was there. But the way he sat, the way he watched, not out of curiosity, but with the calm certainty of someone taking notes on more than just testimony, made the air around him feel different. His name wasn't on any docket, no badge on his chest, but Miles Duval knew this courtroom well, because starting next week, he'd be the one overseeing the entire department. And he came here today, not to intervene, not yet. He came to watch what justice looks like when it thinks no one is watching. Inside Ashmore County Courthouse, the tension didn't ease. It shifted, settled into the walls, crept between the wooden benches, coiled under every breath. No one dared raise their voice yet. Everything felt louder. The trial continued, but some battles weren't being fought on the record. Valerie Kincaid sat tall at the defense table, her shoulders sharp, her jaw set. From the outside, she looked calm, but when she leaned slightly toward Officer Ron Tully beside her, the corner of her mouth curled just enough to betray a different tone. "You see him," she whispered, not bothering to hide the disgust in her voice. "Another one of them sitting back like he's gonna fix the world with a stare." Ron barely tilted his head. "Came in with that watchful vibe, huh?" Valerie let out a small, humorless laugh. "It's always the quiet ones think they know better than the rest of us. Like they're above it all." She kept her gaze steady ahead, but her tone turned sharper. "He'll be writing up reports by tomorrow. Probably already drafting his little statement, systemic, this inequality, that." Ron smirked but didn't reply. He'd heard this before, from her and from others. A few rows back, the wooden bench creaked gently as Miles Duvall adjusted his coat. His notebook rested quietly on his knee, open to a half-filled page. He hadn't moved much since he entered, his body language calm, but his pen, it had been moving. Not constantly, not obsessively, just enough. He wrote in short strokes, careful lines, each word measured. His eyes didn't follow the witness. They scanned the room, watching how people reacted to what was said and what was left unsaid. Next to him, a courtroom employee approached slowly. A woman in her 50s, black with pressed gray slacks and polished flats. Her badge read Anita Coleman. She held a bottle of water in one hand, hesitation in the other. She didn't say anything as she neared Miles, just offered it with a respectful nod. Before Miles could react, a white bailiff named Cooper stepped forward from the side wall, inserting himself between them with an almost effortless motion. "Sir doesn't need that right now," Cooper said softly but firmly, addressing Anita without looking at Miles. Anita blinked, still holding the bottle. She looked at Miles for permission. He met her eyes briefly, gave a faint shake of the head. She didn't push, just nodded, offered a soft, "all right," and turned back without another word. Miles's hand returned to his notebook. From behind, a whisper broke the quiet. "He's not just watching." The voice belonged to a woman seated near the rear corner. Darlene Bishop, her eyes deep and still, followed Miles the way a mother watches a child cross the street. "He's waiting," she added. The woman beside her furrowed her brow. Waiting for what? Darlene didn't blink. For this room to tell on itself. Valerie was back on the stand, her voice steady, her story unchanged. She stuck to the details word for word, like a script rehearsed for weeks. "Suspect lunged at me without provocation," she said. "I was alone and I had to make a judgment call." Her lawyer nodded along. Judge Grayson listened with the same blank face he'd worn all morning, not questioning, not doubting, just waiting for her to finish. "I feared for my safety," Valerie said again. "It wasn't about race, it was about response." She looked over at the mother, then back at the clerk. Then she paused, just slightly. She looked toward the back of the room and locked eyes with Miles, only for a second. But it was enough. Her words stalled. Her throat tightened. She recovered quickly, but the slip had happened. Miles didn't flinch, didn't frown, just stared back, calm, knowing, unbothered. He wrote something down. Judge Grayson cleared his throat. "Continue, Officer Kincaid." Valerie snapped her eyes forward. Outside, the moment the courtroom seemed unchanged. But for those who were really watching, something had shifted. The whispering wasn't in the gallery anymore. It was in people's heads. And Miles Duvall, the man in gray, just kept listening, not to the words, but to the truth behind them. When the judge called for a recess, the air in the courtroom didn't relax. It shifted, subtle, charged. People stretched and murmured to each other, but the undercurrent of tension still pulsed. Beneath every step, every glance, Miles Duvall didn't move. He remained seated, quiet, still watching. Valerie Kincaid stepped down from the witness stand with the deliberate grace of someone who thought she was winning. Her eyes skimmed the crowd until they landed on him, unmoving in the third row, a notebook closed neatly on his lap. She walked toward him, slowly, confidently. Her badge wasn't on, but it didn't matter. She wore her authority like armor. "You think you're clever," she said softly, her lips barely parting. "Filming inside a courtroom? That's a felony, sweetheart." Miles didn't answer. His gaze didn't flinch. That silence, once dismissed as passivity, now held weight. Valerie leaned in, her voice dropping. "You all think you can sneak in here with your little civil rights agendas and make people like me look bad. But let me tell you something, this isn't your playground. It's my house." She smiled, but there was no kindness in it, just calculation. Without breaking eye contact, she slipped a small, folded paper into the inner pocket of his coat. The motion was practiced like she'd done it before. Then she turned on her heel, striding away like nothing had happened. two officers stood near the courtroom doors, half watching. Valerie made a slight motion with her chin. That was all it took. "Excuse me, officers," she said loud enough to catch the attention of the room. "This man's been acting suspiciously. I believe he's in possession of unauthorized recordings and possibly internal police documents." A hush fell. The taller officer, Tully, approached first. "Sir, do you mind if we check your belongings?" Miles rose slowly, calm as ever. He handed over his notebook without a word. His movements were unhurried, his eyes unreadable. The second officer, Ramirez, reached into the coat pocket and pulled out the slip of paper Valerie had planted. He unfolded it and frowned. "It's a personnel report," he said to Tully. "Looks like restricted material." Valerie crossed her arms, watching him closely. Her expression flickered with satisfaction, just barely. Tully looked at Miles. "Sir, do you want to explain how this got in your possession?" Miles didn't blink. He simply shook his head once. No confusion, no panic. Just a steady refusal to play the game on her terms. Gasps murmured through the courtroom. Whispers rose behind hands. The atmosphere turned electric. Judge Grayson banged his gavel twice. "This is a civil hearing. Remove any disruptions from the room immediately." Valerie stepped slightly to the sidearms still folded. She didn't need to say more. The message was clear. She believed she'd just cornered him. But not everyone was so convinced. From the front of the room, Anita Coleman, the court clerk, narrowed her eyes. She had noticed Valerie lean in earlier just long enough to reach inside his coat. She said nothing now, but she was watching. And in the gallery, Darlene Bishop whispered again, voice low as smoke. "He's not panicking," she said to no one in particular. "He's letting her bury herself." Ramirez looked at Miles once more. "Sir." Still no answer. But this time that silence wasn't empty. It was the silence of someone who'd expected this moment and was waiting for the rest to unfold. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Valerie didn't look as sure of herself. When court resumed, the room settled into a sharp silence. Valerie sat straighter, chin lifted just enough to feign dignity. Miles remained in the third row, still and unreadable, his notebook now back in his coat pocket. Judge Grayson adjusted his robe and cleared his throat before addressing the court. "I have reviewed the motion filed by counsel for the plaintiff." He began, his tone flat, "and I see no compelling reason to delay proceedings." Motion denied. The attorney for the young boy stood trying once more. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this new incident involving Officer Kincaid planting evidence, there is no proof of that accusation," Grayson snapped. "And unless you have direct video or sworn testimony confirming it, I will consider further discussion contemptuous." The boy's mother, seated just behind the plaintiff's table, pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet. She wasn't sobbing anymore. It was something quieter, the kind of crying that made no sound at all. Her son reached over, just a boy in a buttoned shirt, too big for his shoulders, and touched her arm. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered. "We knew they wouldn't believe us." She shook her head, barely managing to speak. "You didn't do anything wrong, baby. You just wanted a soda." Grayson looked up annoyed. "Ma'am, I understand this is emotional, but I must ask you to maintain courtroom decorum." She nodded quickly and wiped her face, but didn't say another word. Neither did the boy, but the silence between them said everything. Valerie didn't look back at them. She didn't have to. Her eyes were locked with the judge's. It was brief, no more than a flicker, but it was enough. A signal passed between them like static, invisible to most unmistakable to those who knew how to watch. Miles saw it. His expression didn't change, but one hand slipped into his coat again, brushing against the cover of the leather-bound notebook. A name was scribbled on the last page. He had written it down during the recess. Across the courtroom, the gallery watched the boy and his mother sink a little deeper into their chairs. No comfort came. No one moved to offer a hand or even a kind glance. No one except him, and still he didn't say a word. It was the defense's turn to speak again, and Valerie took the stand with confidence. Her voice rang out clear, rehearsed, righteous. "I feared for my safety," she said. "The young man was aggressive, uncooperative, and advancing toward me with unknown intent." Her eyes swept over the courtroom and for a moment lingered on Miles. "Law enforcement officers must be trusted to act in real time. I did what was necessary." Grayson gave a small nod, not a legal endorsement, but something softer, approval maybe. No one interrupted, no one objected. The court reporter kept typing keys, tapping like distant footsteps in an empty hallway. And through it all, Miles just watched, quietly. He was the only person in that room who wasn't playing a role. He wasn't a grieving parent. He wasn't a terrified child. He wasn't a proud officer trying to clear her name. He was something else, something still unspoken. And maybe that's why people were starting to notice him more now. not because he raised his voice, but because even in silence he stood for something louder. The hallway outside the courtroom was narrow, too quiet for a space carrying so much weight. People filed past slowly, their voices, hushed shoes tapping against the polished floor. Some avoided looking at Miles as they passed. Others stole glances, quickly turning away. He stood alone near the bench against the far wall, his notebook now tucked away, his hands in his pockets. His presence was calm, unassuming, but not invisible. Valerie Kincaid stepped out a few moments later, heels clicking sharp and fast like punctuation marks on a page she believed she had written. She spotted him almost instantly. She didn't hesitate. With a low, steady tone that barely masked her scorn, she approached him. "I've seen your type before," she said. "Quiet, polite, pretending you're not part of the mess. But I know what you're doing." Miles didn't respond. His eyes stayed forward. "You people think you're rising," she whispered, close enough for her words to carry heat. "But I know what keeps you down. It's not us, it's you, always has been." Still, he said nothing. Valerie tilted her head as if studying him. "Maybe you think silence makes you noble. Maybe you think it gives you power. But let me tell you something." He turned calmly to walk away. She shoved him, hard. The force sent him stumbling sideways, his back hitting the marble wall before he slid to the floor. Gasps scattered down the hallway. A few heads turned. One woman, court visitor holding her phone low, had just tapped record moments earlier. Her camera caught the exact second of impact, the surprise in his eyes, the cold grin flickering across Valerie's face. He didn't shout. He didn't push back. Miles rose slowly, deliberately brushing the dust from his trousers. He adjusted the collar of his gray coat, straightened the crease in one sleeve, and finally looked at her. That look was not anger. It was something quieter, something older. Valerie opened her mouth as if to speak again, but her voice caught. For the first time, her confidence seemed brittle. The hallway had fallen still. Someone whispered behind them, "Did you see that?" Another voice replied. He didn't even flinch. The woman with the phone lowered it gently, her eyes wide, heart racing. She didn't know who the man was, but something about his silence unsettled her more than any outburst could have. Miles turned back toward the courtroom, walking as though nothing had happened, as though this moment, this humiliation, had already been accounted for in whatever plan he carried quietly in that coat pocket. Valerie remained where she was, lips slightly parted. She looked around and realized for the first time not everyone was pretending not to see. Some had witnessed it, and others had recorded it. But Miles, he hadn't needed an audience. He had chosen not to speak, and somehow that silence was beginning to echo louder than her voice ever could. As the courtroom settled back into place, the defense team stood with a smirk barely concealed. "Your Honor, we respectfully move to dismiss all charges. My client, Officer Valerie Kincaid, acted within reason. The child was aggressive. There is no solid evidence of wrongdoing." Judge Grayson didn't even pretend to deliberate. He leaned forward, gavel in hand. But then came a voice. Calm, commanding, razor sharp. "Your Honor, that won't be necessary." It wasn't loud, but the entire room turned. Miles Duvall was on his feet. The quiet man in gray was now walking straight toward the bench, every step echoing with a purpose too heavy to ignore. Valerie's face drained of color. She whispered something to her colleague, but her voice caught halfway. Miles stopped in front of the judge. No hesitation, no fear. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather badge case, laid it flat on the edge of the bench. Grayson frowned, leaning in. "Miles Duvall, Chief of Police, appointed last week by the governor's office to oversee this county's internal affairs." A gasp spread through the room like wildfire. Phones dropped, hands covered mouths. In the back, a clerk accidentally knocked over a water cup. Valerie blinked twice. "Chief?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone. Miles turned to face the room, not with arrogance, but with unmistakable authority. "I sat in this room and listened to lies passed off as law. I watched a courtroom twist the truth because it thought no one important was watching, but I was." He turned to Grayson, his voice cut cleaner than the gavel ever had. "You denied motions without cause. You silenced a grieving mother. You allowed a witness to be harassed outside your courtroom. And you let an officer plant evidence on me." Gasps again, murmurs now rising like thunderclouds. Miles took one deliberate step closer to the bench. "You know what the real threat is, Your Honor. It's not a boy with a soda can. It's a system so used to lying it panics when someone finally tells the truth." Valerie staggered back half a step. Her lawyer tried to object, but the words died in his throat. Judge Grayson sat frozen. His hand hovered above the gavel, now too heavy to lift. Miles scanned the room, gaze sharp. "To the citizens in this room, I wasn't here to watch. I was here to witness. And now so are you." A beat of silence. Then a voice from this gallery, trembling but clear. God bless you, Chief. Miles gave the judge one last look, firm and final. I'll be filing federal charges, effective immediately. This court is no longer under your protection. He turned, buttoned his coat, and walked back to his seat, not as a man in gray, but as the storm none of them saw coming. And for the first time that day, the gavel never came down. For a few moments after Miles Duval revealed his title, the courtroom sat frozen in stunned silence. You could almost hear the breath catch in people's throats, the air so thick it pressed down on every shoulder in the room. Even the ticking of the courthouse clock felt too loud. Valerie stiffened. Her lips twitched into an uneasy smile. Well, she said, voice louder than it needed to be, that doesn't change the fact that this civil hearing is now adjourned. There is no standing evidence to proceed. She glanced toward Judge Grayson. He nodded just slightly, but it was there. But Miles didn't ask. He didn't wait. He walked forward calm and assured like a tide rising without warning. From the inside of his jacket, he pulled out a thin envelope and handed it to the court officer, who looked at the seal and turned pale. The Department of Justice has issued a federal mandate for an internal investigation. Miles said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet force that demanded attention. Effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the room like wind over dry leaves. Before Valerie could speak, the courtroom doors opened. A woman with a press badge around her neck stepped in, followed by 2 cameramen. Behind them, a man in a dark gray suit, federal credentials visible, walked swiftly to the front. Agent Shaw, Internal Affairs, he said, showing his badge to the judge. We've been following Chief Duval's inquiry. Valerie's eyes darted between them, panic flickering beneath the surface. Then, with precise timing, one of the agents connected a laptop to the court's monitor. The screen came alive with footage from earlier that day, the hallway. Valerie's voice rang out cold and sharp. You people think you are rising, but I know what keeps you down. Then the shove. The room inhaled as one. A gasp moved like a wave. The video faded, replaced by an audio clip. It was Valerie again speaking to a fellow officer. They don't need to be provoked. Just push them a little, they show their true face. Gasps turned into murmurs of disbelief. Someone whispered, "She said that?" Miles didn't flinch. He simply opened his notebook, turned to a page, and read aloud excerpts from internal reports signed and time-stamped, showing repeated complaints against Valerie that were inconveniently dismissed by Judge Grayson's chambers. He looked directly at Grayson now. There's a difference between being a judge and being a shield for the lawless, he said. Today, that line ends here. Grayson tried to speak, but Agent Shaw stepped forward. Sir, per Section 41 of Judicial Conduct, we're placing a temporary hold on your authority pending full review. It was the first time Judge Grayson looked small. Miles turned slightly, his voice quiet now, almost too gentle to hold so much weight. I didn't come here to make noise. I came here because justice isn't supposed to be a show. It's supposed to be a standard. And then he said it slowly, as if letting the room breathe again after holding its breath all day. Justice doesn't whisper anymore. It speaks and it listens. The room didn't erupt. It didn't cheer. It simply stood still, as if it knew something sacred had just been restored. The courtroom felt different that morning, heavier, as if it had finally realized the weight of its own silence. Valerie Kincaid didn't show up. Her seat sat cold and empty, and the whispers came quickly. Reporters gathered by the courthouse steps, lenses pointed, hungry for a glimpse of the woman who once walked those halls like she owned them. Now she was nowhere to be found. Judge Grayson, however, sat in his chair, lips tight, spine stiff. His gavel remained untouched. And yet everyone in that room knew he was already cornered. Miles returned, not in silence this time, but with a quiet command. Behind him walked representatives from the Department of Justice, the State Attorney General's office, and members of a federal investigation task force. It wasn't a show of power, it was the beginning of accountability. He placed a thick binder on the bench in front of Grayson. 317 pages, he said, each one a case mishandled. A voice silenced, a life altered. The judge said nothing. He didn't even look at the report. Miles turned to the courtroom. This room belongs to the people, and today they reclaim it. Applause didn't follow, not yet. People weren't ready to celebrate. They were still trying to believe it was real. A staffer approached with a document, an online petition with over 30,000 signatures from citizens of the county demanding Judge Grayson's immediate suspension. Names scrawled in digital ink. Ordinary people finally speaking. Then a familiar voice was called to the front. The mother of the 14-year-old boy, the one beaten for holding a soda can. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked, but her voice held steady. My son stopped talking after that day, she began. He stopped sleeping. He started asking why his skin made people afraid. She looked at Miles, then around the room. Today, I saw him smile again. Her words fell into the silence like a stone into water. No one dared speak. Even Grayson dropped his gaze. And then right as Miles was preparing to leave, someone burst through the courtroom doors. A marshal approached Miles and whispered into his ear. Outside, across the courthouse plaza, Valerie Kincaid was in handcuffs. She had been arrested after an anonymous tip. Video evidence, planted documents, abuse of power. It was all there. The image flashed across phones and screens like wildfire. Valerie, once smug and untouchable, now in cuffs surrounded by federal officers. Back inside, Miles paused near the back of the courtroom. A young black boy sat near the aisle, barely 12, wide-eyed, knees pressed together. Their eyes met. Miles leaned in slightly. I came to clean house, he said, and I'm not done. He straightened his coat and walked toward the exit, the crowd parting in quiet awe. By that afternoon, the photo had already gone viral. Not the one of Valerie, the other one. Miles stepping out of the courtroom, head-high coat, still gray, expression unreadable. The caption read, "He never raised his voice, but the whole system heard him." The morning after the courtroom upheaval, the story was everywhere. Cable news played the same clip on repeat. Miles Duvall, calm as stone, stepping forward, holding out his badge and saying, "I came to see justice," when it thought no one was watching. The headline below read, "The silent sheriff who spoke for a generation." Social media lit up. Hashtags trended. Tweets turned into articles. Blogs turned into panels on national news. But more powerful than all that were the voices that followed. A retired teacher in Georgia posted, "For years I've taught civics. Today I finally believe in it again." A mother from Alabama wrote, "My son was arrested for skipping school. They treated him like a criminal. I watched that man stand there and say nothing and speak louder than anyone ever could." And from a small town in Mississippi, a young black boy named Khalil mailed a hand-drawn picture of Miles standing tall in front of a courthouse, shielding a child behind him. Even the news anchors seemed moved. One of them, usually dry and distant, spoke directly into the camera and said, "He never raised his voice, but he raised the standard." Still not everyone agreed. Some loud corners pushed back. Too political, they said. Too theatrical. But their words barely echoed, drowned out by the quiet strength of something real. Miles didn't go on television. He didn't sit down for interviews. But he read every letter that reached his desk. Letters from veterans, from school children, from elderly couples who thought they'd never live to see justice work like this. One letter, written in cursive and sealed in a floral envelope, simply said, "You gave us back our dignity." That afternoon, as the sun hung low behind the courthouse, the boy's mother came to see him again. No cameras, no crowd, just her. She held out her hand, voice trembling but steady. "You didn't just protect my son," she said. "You protected all of us." Miles didn't say a word, but something softened in his eyes. And then just a small, quiet smile. Not of pride, not of victory, but of understanding. That night, a vigil formed on the courthouse lawn. No protest signs, just candles, folding chairs. Songs played low on a guitar. Little kids drew chalk outlines of Miles in his gray coat across the pavement, while old folks sat and watched. A young man whispered, "We're not just standing for justice. We're standing because someone finally stood with us." And in the upstairs window of the courthouse, Miles watched it all in silence. He didn't need to say a thing, because now the whole country was listening. The air felt different that morning, softer somehow. Miles walked down a quiet street where not long ago fear used to sit on every porch. Now people waved, some just nodded. One little girl, barely taller than the mailbox, ran up and pressed a daisy into his hand before darting off again. He didn't say much. He never did. But every step he took said something. He passed the precinct. The flag hung still. A few officers inside glanced up, then quickly looked away. Some with shame, some with something closer to respect. A small coffee shop on the corner had its door propped open. Inside, the owner looked up from the counter, smiled wide, and pointed to a newspaper resting on the counter. There on the front page was a photo of Miles standing tall in the courtroom, the crowd behind him frozen in that moment of revelation. The headline simply read, "One man, no noise, all justice." The owner didn't speak, just slid the paper toward him and mouthed two words, "Thank you." Miles nodded, took his coffee black, sat by the window watching the sun climb through the morning fog. His phone buzzed once, a message from the Department of Justice. They wanted him in Washington, a new position, national oversight, bigger scope, Louder halls. He stared at it for a while, the screen glowing quietly in his hand. Then with a breath just deep enough to matter, he locked the phone and placed it face down. Justice didn't need a louder voice. It just needed one that didn't shake. Later that evening, he sat by his desk at home, the same worn leather notebook beside him, the same quiet lamp glow. He penned one last letter, addressed to the boy at the center of it all. Your name matters, so does your truth. You didn't have to shout to be heard, and you didn't need to win to be right. I saw you. I believed you. One day someone else will need you to do the same for them. Be ready. He folded the letter with care, slipped it into an envelope, wrote the boy's name in clean, careful print. Then as twilight settled in, Miles walked to the courthouse steps, alone. No press, no fanfare, just the whisper of wind through the trees. He stood still for a moment, the city behind him, the light behind him, his shadow falling forward across the steps. It wasn't a statue, it wasn't a headline, it wasn't a speech. It was a man who never raised his voice, but made a system listen. And then with the quiet steadiness of someone who had done exactly what he came to do, Miles Duvall walked on. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story. What Miles Duvall showed us today isn't just about one courtroom or one act of injustice. It's about the quiet strength of dignity, the power of truth spoken without shouting, and the courage to stand firm when the system hopes you'll stay silent. This story reminds us that change doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in, quietly takes a seat, and waits. And when the moment is right, it speaks not just for itself, but for all of us. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more true-hearted narratives that challenge injustice and honor the human spirit. Your support gives our creative team the strength to keep digging deeper, telling stories that matter, and giving voice to those who've been ignored for far too long. And as always, we leave you with one thought to carry forward. Justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it walks quietly and changes everything. We'll see you in the next story.
He slammed her against the wall. No warning, no questions, just the badge and the rage behind it. But what if the woman he grabbed was sent to fix the very system he thought he controlled? He didn't know who she was, but by the time he found out, it was already too late, and justice was already watching. If that first moment made your heart race or your blood boil, don't just keep it to yourself. Tap like, share this story with someone who still believes in accountability, and subscribe to Mr. Max, our stories to hear voices that don't get heard often enough. Now come with me, back to that courthouse hallway, where silence ended and power got turned on its head. They say justice is blind, but sometimes it's just looking the other way. That morning, the courthouse hallway was packed. People in cheap suits whispered prayers, heels clicking on tile. It was one of those days when everything felt tense, like the walls themselves were waiting for something to break. And then it happened. Officer Grant Ellison stormed down the corridor like he owned the place. Broad shoulders, tight jaw, eyes always scanning for someone to control. He didn't walk, he patrolled. Like this wasn't a place of law, it was a battlefield. And to him, anyone not in uniform was a potential threat, especially if their skin wasn't white. A black woman stood near the benches, just observing, not speaking, not filming, just there, watching the courtroom doors, maybe waiting for someone inside. She wore a dark gray blouse, simple pants, nothing flashy, late 30s, maybe early 40s, calm, still. Grant barely glanced before snapping, "ID?" She didn't move, just looked at him, quiet, steady. That kind of silence that doesn't mean fear. It means she's measuring you. He didn't wait. With one hand, he yanked her bag off her shoulder. With the other, he grabbed her wrist and twisted her toward the wall. The metal of the cuffs clicked loud, too loud for a place meant to hold dignity. She hit the wall with her shoulder first, then the side of her face, hard enough to draw a gasp from someone nearby. But no one stepped in. Phones came out, fingers tapped red circles, but feet stayed frozen. Eyes darted away. The crowd did what crowds often do when injustice walks in wearing a badge. They watched, quietly. And she never raised her voice, never said a word. She just turned her head slowly and looked him straight in the eye. Not with fear, with clarity, with something deeper. Like she knew exactly what this was, like she had seen it before, maybe too many times to count. Grant stood over her, breathing heavy, knuckles white around the cuffs. His face said control, but his body twitched. Just enough to show he wasn't as sure as he pretended to be. And somewhere, just out of frame, a recording light blinked red. You could feel it in the air, that this wasn't just another ugly moment. This was a crack, and something, or someone, was about to break through. But before that, there was only silence. The kind that wraps around you when something's gone too far, and nobody knows what to do about it. Except her. She knew, and what she did next would change everything. There's something cold about courthouses. Not just the marble floors or the air conditioning set a little too low. It's the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, the kind that doesn't come from temperature, but from silence, from posture, from power. The benches are wooden, straight-backed and unforgiving. They creak when you shift, but no one dares move too much. The walls are beige, bland, designed to neutralize emotion, to mute voices. Everything in this place whispers one message: fall in line. The bailiffs know their place. They open doors. They nod to judges. They rarely make eye contact with anyone else. The clerks click away on their keyboards, eyes trained forward, as if looking up might implicate them in something they'd rather not see. And the officers? They walk with a certain rhythm. Boots polished, belts heavy with gear, not for protection, but for presence. The weight of it all seems deliberate, like they're always just one step from control or confrontation. Grant Ellison moved through this machine like a cog that believed it was the engine. He'd been here for years, long enough to know the rhythms, to read the unspoken rules, long enough to believe he could bend them when needed. He saw himself as a filter. His job, in his eyes, wasn't just to keep order. It was to decide who belonged, who deserved to be inside the courtroom, who could sit quietly and wait, who looked like they might be trouble, based on nothing more than skin tone, clothing, or posture. Grant didn't wait for cues from the judge. He didn't ask the clerks. He certainly didn't ask the people he grabbed. He acted, quick, sharp, loud, as if sound alone made him right. He wasn't the only one like that, but he was one of the loudest, and no one had ever stopped him. They let him move like that because to them, he brought order. But order isn't the same as justice. And everyone who's ever sat on one of those hard benches knows it. That day, after shoving the woman against the wall, Grant returned to his post like nothing had happened. He didn't file a report. He didn't speak to the sergeant. He just stood near the courtroom door, arms folded, daring someone to question him. The woman, Nadine, never said a word. She picked up her bag, dusted off her sleeve, and calmly sat down again, eyes forward, lips pressed shut. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from fear. It came from knowing, from restraint, from choosing not to react, yet. And that silence, it carried more weight than any badge on his chest. People watched her, some out of curiosity, some out of shame. A few glanced at their phones, checking the clip they had just filmed. No one deleted it. No one offered her water. No one said, "Are you okay?" Because here, in this place, things like that happen all the time. And folks have been trained to let them. It wasn't the first time someone got pushed without cause. It wouldn't be the last. But this time, something felt different. It lingered. Maybe it was the way she stared at Grant without blinking. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in how she sat, how she refused to touch the welt rising on her cheek. Or maybe, just maybe, people could sense that the gears in the machine had just caught on something. Something unexpected. She looked like a woman who came here for a reason. And whatever that reason was, she wasn't done. Not yet. For a moment, no one moved. The hallway, once filled with footsteps and murmurs, went still, like someone had pulled the plug on all the noise. Even the air felt heavier, like it didn't want to carry what was about to happen next. Nadine stood slowly, calmly. No rush, no panic. She brushed the crease off her sleeve with the back of her hand, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, then reached inside with a deliberate grace, like someone choosing every breath. Grant watched her, confused. His stance stiffened, like he was bracing for another challenge. Another complaint. Another routine excuse from someone trying to act tougher than they looked. But Nadine didn't argue. She opened her wallet, flipped it open, and held it out for everyone to see. A gold shield. Police blue. A name in raised silver lettering, Chief Nadine Monroe. District 12 Police Department. For a second, it didn't register. Then it did. A young officer down the hallway gasped, his mouth falling open like a door unlatched in a storm. A few feet away, a court clerk dropped a pen. It hit the floor with a click that felt too loud. Inside the courtroom, the judge had been mid-sentence, but his voice caught. He paused, leaned back slightly in his chair, and glanced toward the hallway with narrowed eyes. Someone whispered, "No, another. She's the new chief?" But Nadine didn't need the noise. She looked directly at Grant, her voice even, measured, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "I was sworn in yesterday," she said, "and I came here today to see how justice is applied in this building. Quietly, observationally, no announcements, no special treatment." Then she let the silence speak. It hung there, pressing in from all sides, until even the ceiling seemed to lean in closer. Grant didn't blink. His hand loosened on the radio, clipped to his chest. His jaw flexed, but no words came out. And for the first time, maybe in his whole career, he looked unsure. Not just caught off guard, but exposed. "And now," Nadine added, her voice soft as a breath, "I've seen exactly what I came to see." That was the blow. Not a scream, not a scene. Just truth, wrapped in composure. Delivered with eyes that had seen too much to be shaken. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing to say, no protocol for this. No line from the handbook that could pull him out of it. And the people? They just watched. Phones still recording, eyes wide, breaths held. Not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. The sun wasn't even up yet. Nadine sat in her car parked across the street from the courthouse, engine off, window half cracked. A warm coffee cup rested on the dashboard, untouched. The kind of morning where everything is quiet, but your mind won't stop moving. She leaned back against the seat, eyes fixed on the building in front of her. That old courthouse. Same stone steps, same faded brick, same cold glass doors. Different reason for being here. She hadn't parked here in years. Not since the day she was 17, holding her mother's hand, trying to understand why security guards were shouting at them like they'd done something wrong. Her mother hadn't raised her voice. She never did. She wore a sleeveless blouse and a long skirt. Nothing fancy. Nothing flashy. But a female officer stopped them at the entrance, glanced at her mother from head to toe, and said coldly, "You can't come in here dressed like that." Nadine remembered the heat of her mother's skin as she squeezed her hand tighter. She remembered how the officer's words didn't sound like rules. They sounded like judgment, and how no one around them, not one person, spoke up. They had traveled 2 buses to get there, but they turned around, just like that. That was the first time Nadine learned that silence could be louder than anything else in the room. She sighed now, years later, running a finger along the rim of her coffee lid. It was strange, coming back with the title Chief pinned to her name. You'd think it would feel like a victory, but it didn't feel like a win. It felt like weight. She reached over to the passenger seat and picked up a folder, thin, old, worn at the corners. Inside was a rejection letter. One she'd kept all these years. It was from the academy, the first time she applied. Back then she was fresh out of college, determined, sharp, fit. She passed every written exam, aced every physical test. But during training, she filed a formal complaint after witnessing an instructor making racist comments toward another recruit. They called it insubordination. She called it the truth. And the next week she was out. No explanation, no apology, just an envelope. She could have walked away from law enforcement then, and she almost did. But her mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. And in one of those long nights between appointments and prayers, Nadine found something in an old keepsake box. A letter. Folded 4 times, ink fading at the edges. "Justice doesn't wear a badge," it said. "It walks in your spine, if you feel it there. Don't let anyone break it." Her mother had written it years before, after that humiliating day at the courthouse. Nadine never showed the letter to anyone, not even the review board when she reapplied. But she carried it, literally, in her wallet, right behind her ID. It wasn't a badge, it was a promise. Now, in the quiet of this early morning, she unfolded that letter again, let the words settle over her one more time. She looked at her reflection in the rearview mirror, eyes older, wiser, but still carrying that same fire. She wasn't that girl holding her mother's hand anymore. And she wasn't the cadet begging for fairness from a broken system. She was the one walking back into the building, not as a witness, not as a victim, but as the chief. And justice, it was still in her spine, steady, unshaken. She closed the folder, slid it under her seat, and finally took a sip of her coffee. The bitterness was familiar, but this time it tasted like purpose. She opened the door, stepped out onto the street, and straightened her blazer. No sirens, no spotlight, no announcement, just a quiet decision. Today she wouldn't be silent. The door shut with a soft click. No echo, no metal slam, just finality. They were alone. A narrow conference room tucked behind the administrative offices. No cameras, no reporters, no lawyers. Just beige walls, a wooden table, and the kind of quiet that feels like a storm waiting to start. Grant Ellison sat stiff in the chair across from her, arms crossed tight, jaw locked. He hadn't said a word since she summoned him. But his eyes, they burned, like a man cornered and still trying to pretend he wasn't. Nadine placed a file on the table between them. Thick, marked with a red tab. She didn't sit down. Not yet. Before you say anything, she said calmly, I'd suggest you look through that. Grant didn't move. Nadine flipped the folder open herself. One page, then another, then another. Inside, printed screenshots, body cam stills, incident reports with highlighted inconsistencies, internal memos that somehow disappeared before becoming formal complaints. Names, dates, patterns. You think no one was watching, she said, her tone level, not angry, just steady. But someone always is, a bystander, a victim, a young officer who's not as loyal to your silence as you thought. Grant scoffed, a bitter sound. He reached for one of the papers, skimmed it with practiced arrogance. This is garbage, he muttered. You dragged me in here to what? Make a point? Humiliate me again? You already did that out there in front of the whole damn courthouse. He leaned forward, voice rising. You think I didn't see the look in your eyes? This isn't about justice. This is personal. Nadine finally sat. She didn't flinch. She didn't fire back. She let his words settle, hang, fade. Then she spoke, quiet, almost too quiet. You didn't just humiliate me, Officer Ellison. You humiliated the badge. Grant blinked. Excuse me? She leaned slightly closer, not aggressively, but with purpose. That uniform doesn't give you the right to grab, to shove, to profile. It gives you the responsibility to protect, to serve with restraint, with integrity. You forgot that a long time ago. She paused, eyes fixed on his. And worse, you taught others to forget it too. Grant laughed, short, hollow. You've been chief for what, 2 days? And suddenly you're the moral compass of the entire department? He pushed the file back toward her. This is a witch hunt. Old cases. Complaints from people who hate cops. You think any of this holds up? Nadine didn't answer immediately. She took a breath. Let the silence do its job. Then she reached into her jacket and pulled out a flash drive. She placed it on top of the file. That's from the locker room camera, she said softly. You thought it was off. It wasn't. That's you telling a rookie to handle the loud ones early. That's you laughing when a man with a stutter was cuffed before he could explain he was a witness, not a suspect. Grant's expression shifted. Just a flicker. But it was there. You don't know what it's like out there, he snapped. You walk in now with your title and your speeches. Don't talk to me about what it's like, she interrupted, her voice still calm but razor sharp. I was the one being watched while doing everything right. I was the one who had to memorize procedures twice as well, because I knew I wouldn't get a second chance if I slipped. She leaned back, finally. The difference between you and me, Grant, is that I never used the badge as a shield. I carried it as a weight. He shifted in his chair, suddenly smaller. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Nadine stood, picked up the file, the flash drive, held them both in her hands. This isn't about revenge, she said. It's about reckoning. She walked to the door, stopped just before turning the handle. You built a career on fear. But that only works until someone stops being afraid of you. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see the side of her face. You've been the loudest voice in the room for years, Grant. Let's see how you handle silence. And with that, she left him sitting there, alone. No spotlight, no audience, just the sound of the air vent buzzing and the heavy, bitter taste of being truly seen. It started with a clip, just 23 seconds long, a shaky cell phone recording, grainy, slightly tilted. You could see the edge of a patrol car, a sidewalk, and a boy, maybe 15, maybe 16, standing with his hands half raised. His backpack was already on the ground. His voice, though faint, was calm. I didn't do anything. I was just... Then came the shove. Officer Grant Ellison lunged forward, grabbing the boy by the collar and flinging him sideways. The kid hit the curb hard, shoulder first. You could hear the snap even through the bad audio. The boy screamed once, then went silent. The clip froze on his face, twisted in pain, hand cradling his arm, legs too stunned to move. It was the kind of footage that made people stop scrolling. And it was posted by Tessa Duvall. She uploaded it without a caption, just the video and a date. 6 years ago. Crestwood County. My little brother. It didn't take long to spread. By noon, it was on every major feed. Hashtags started stacking up. Justice for Jaylen, stand with her, he was just a boy. People remembered that name. Jaylen Duvall, the kid who resisted arrest outside a library. The news never showed the clip back then, just a mugshot, though he was never charged. The arm had healed crooked. And the family? They'd stayed quiet until now. That evening, Tessa stood in front of a live camera. No fancy backdrop, just a brick wall behind her, a single mic in her hand, and the look of someone who had carried silence too long. Her voice didn't shake. Not once. 6 years ago, my brother was hurt by Officer Grant Ellison. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't a threat. He was a teenager who had missed his bus and was sitting on the curb reading a comic book. That day, Grant broke his arm. What he really broke was our trust. She looked directly into the lens. He never said sorry, never faced discipline, never even acknowledged it happened. But I'm not here to ask for an apology. I'm here so no one else has to stay quiet like we did. She paused, letting that sink in. If you think silence keeps you safe, it doesn't. It just delays the truth. The broadcast only lasted 2 minutes, but by morning it had more than 8 million views. The comment sections overflowed. Why did it take this long? Where was internal affairs? My son looks like Jaylen. This could have been my kid. The pressure cooker cracked open, and this time the steam wasn't staying in the room. News anchors called it a breaking point. Activists called for Grant's resignation. Even officers in other districts began quietly unfollowing him on social media. And everywhere, the hashtag Stand With Her lit up the digital sky. Nadine saw the clip around 5:30 a.m. She was already awake, couldn't sleep much lately. The email came from an old contact in the media bureau. Just 3 words in the subject line. You need this. She watched it once. Then again. Then sat with her hands folded for a long time, staring out the window as the sun pushed its way into the sky. She remembered that name, Jaylen Duvall. She remembered the report. Back then it had been framed as use of force in response to non-compliance. But there had been no body cam footage, no investigation, just paperwork, a 15-year-old kid with a broken arm. Now the silence around that file felt deafening. At 7 a.m., Nadine walked into the precinct. There was a different kind of air in the room that morning. Not fear, not anger. Something quieter, heavier. The kind of quiet that comes when people know the wind has shifted, but haven't figured out which way it's blowing yet. Grant wasn't there. He'd taken a sick day. But the murmurs followed him anyway. One officer leaned against the coffee counter, scrolling on her phone. Another sat staring at his screen, unread emails piling up, while the words Duvall video trended on the ticker bar above. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew something had cracked. And this time, it wasn't going to be swept away with a memo or a retraining session. Tessa didn't post again that day. She didn't need to. The video had spoken. The silence had ended, and the ripple it sent out was just getting started. Grant Ellison stepped through the front doors of Crestwood Police Department on a Monday morning, expecting the usual nods, the usual, "Morning, sir," even the weightless privilege of being noticed. But what met him was nothing. No one looked up. No one greeted him. The door hissed shut behind him, sealing off a hallway thick with silence. Not the good kind, the kind that speaks. People saw him. That was obvious, but their eyes just slid away, like rain on glass, like he'd turned into part of the wall. Once, Grant was the officer rookies looked up to, the one with the reputation for being tough but necessary. People used to say, he gets things done. Now, no one said anything, not even the ones who used to slap his back in the locker room or chuckle at his dry, mean humor. He passed the break room. The coffee machine buzzed softly. A young officer poured herself a cup, glanced up, and turned her back. Not in a rush, just quietly, deliberately. One of those movements that cuts deeper than a shove. In the main hallway, someone pinned a new flyer on the bulletin board. It fluttered slightly as Grant walked past. He didn't catch what it said. He didn't need to. He opened his inbox. The subject line said it all. Administrative leave. Effective immediately. No explanation, no signature. Just an attached PDF with his name and badge number. He stared at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, then leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, blinking hard, like maybe the lights had changed, and he just didn't catch it. After a moment, he did what he'd never thought he'd have to do. He typed an email. Fast. Heated. Defensive. Subject, urgent. Internal division. Chief Monroe is tearing this department apart. The public is turning on us. She's feeding them a narrative that paints officers like me as villains. If we don't stand up now, morale will collapse. We need leadership. We need action before it's too late. He hit send, then sat back waiting for something. A reply came within 10 minutes. From Nadine Monroe herself. One sentence. No, you tore it apart. I'm just cleaning up. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no room for debate. And later that afternoon, the email leaked. No one ever said how, but it showed up in the department group chat, then on a law enforcement subreddit, and finally in a local paper's digital edition. Not the whole thing. Just one line. She's tearing us apart. Beneath the quote, an anonymous officer replied, "No, sir, we were already broken. She just turned on the lights." That's when it really started. The unspoken shift. Grant came back the next day to collect some things. Nothing big. Just a few files, his gym shoes, the mug with the chipped handle he used every shift. The station looked the same, but it didn't feel the same. It felt like he had become a stranger in a place he used to command. He passed by a trainee, barely 20, fresh uniform, still stiff in the shoulders. The kid looked up, met Grant's eyes just for a second, then tugged his jacket across his chest, covering the Academy logo on his shirt, like he didn't want to be seen with it. Or with him. Grant froze for half a step. That stung more than any headline. He turned down the hall toward the exit. One of the lieutenants was talking to two junior officers. The moment they saw Grant, the conversation stalled. Not with drama, just stopped. One officer tilted her head down, stared at her boots. The other gave a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then busied himself with his phone. No one asked if he needed help. No one asked where he was going. No one asked anything. It wasn't anger. It was worse. It was detachment. He stopped near the locker room and looked back once, hoping, maybe foolishly, that someone would call his name, say something, even something sarcastic. But the silence stayed, heavy, final. There was no hearing, no official verdict, no headlines screaming guilty. But the sentence had already been served, not in court, in people. And the worst part, he understood it. He had spent years convincing himself he was holding the line, protecting the system. But what he was really doing was hiding behind it. Now, stripped of its cover, he was just a man. A man people once respected, and now walked away from. There are punishments you can see, suspensions, fines, write-ups, and then there are the ones you can't. The ones that live in every empty hallway, every back turned, every conversation that dies when you walk into a room. You don't need a courtroom to feel that kind of judgment. You just need a department full of people who've stopped believing you ever deserved the badge in the first place. The meeting room wasn't big, just enough for a long table, a pot of lukewarm coffee, and 20 folding chairs that creaked when people shifted. But that morning, something in the air made it feel different. Lighter, still nervous, still cautious, but laced with something that hadn't lived there in a while. Possibility. Nadine Monroe stood at the head of the table. No podium, no script, just her and a folder under her arm, and the kind of stillness that comes from choosing your words with care. Across from her, officers, old and new, filled the seats. Some crossed arms, some took notes, a few just watched, waiting, measuring her. Not because they didn't trust her, but because they didn't yet know how much they could. Nadine cleared her throat once, then began. Rebuilding starts with recognizing who we've lost, not just the ones who left, but the ones we pushed out. She paused, looked around the room. Today, we begin with someone we never should have let go in the first place. She turned to the side, nodded toward the door, and in walked Leticia Torres. The room shifted. Some heads snapped up. Others blinked. A couple jaws, not dramatically but noticeably, dropped. Leticia walked in with her back straight, chin high, and the kind of calm power that doesn't demand a room's attention. It draws it. 6 years ago, she'd been one of the few female officers on the tactical team, respected by many, challenged by more. She'd led a hostage negotiation that made national news, but what people remembered most was her demotion. The memo back then had been vague, concerns about leadership tone and command presence, but everyone knew what it really meant. She didn't lead like a man, and some men weren't ready to be led by her. That morning, she stood in front of them again, not as a cautionary tale, but as a beginning. Nadine gestured toward her. Officer Torres is being reinstated, effective immediately, as deputy training lead. She'll oversee both field development and cultural reform across the district. Someone clapped. Just one. Then another joined in, and before long the whole room, slowly, steadily, was applauding. Leticia held up her hand gently, and the sound died down. She stepped forward, her voice even, strong. "I wasn't silent these past few years," she said. "I was sidelined. But you didn't silence me. You just made me wait longer to speak." A pause. "Now that I'm back, I'm not asking to be heard. I'm speaking so others know they can too." That was it. No theatrics, no revenge. Just a statement of return. Nadine watched from her seat, and in that moment, she didn't look like a chief giving someone a second chance. She looked like a woman opening a door and holding it open for others to walk through. After the meeting, the hallway buzzed with quiet energy. One of the rookies, still new enough to fidget with his badge clip, whispered to another, "I didn't know she was that Leticia Torres." The other nodded. "Yeah, and she's our trainer now. You believe that?" And not in a mocking way, in a hopeful way, like maybe things were changing. Later that week, Leticia ran her first session. It wasn't about tactics. It wasn't even about law. It was about listening. She stood in front of a mixed group, young recruits, mid-career officers, and even 2 senior lieutenants who chose to sit in. She asked one question: when was the last time someone listened to you? Not because of your badge, but because of your story. The room sat quiet for a while. Then someone answered. Then another. And slowly, the silence began to break in the right direction. Nadine, standing behind the glass window that overlooked the training room, folded her arms across her chest. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But there was a warmth in her face. A kind of soft strength that said, This is what it's supposed to look like. She didn't need people to cheer for her. She didn't need banners or headlines. She just needed this department to feel human again. And that started by bringing back the voices it had tried to forget. They would still face challenges. Of course they would. Change didn't come easy. Trust didn't come fast. But it had begun. Not with policies, not with press conferences, but with a simple truth. Justice starts with who you choose to stand beside. And that morning, Nadine Monroe stood beside the ones who had been left behind, because they were the ones most ready to lead what comes next. The hallway felt longer that morning. Grant Ellison walked it alone, his steps slow, not from exhaustion, but from something heavier. Something he couldn't name yet. Something that felt like walking through a version of his life that no longer belonged to him. When he reached the glass doors of what used to be his office, he tried his keycard. The red light blinked. Denied. He tried again. Same result. The badge clipped to his belt, same badge he wore through riots, arrests, and late-night shifts, suddenly looked meaningless. He stepped back, glanced around. No one met his eyes. A staff assistant passed behind him with a stack of folders and didn't say a word. An IT technician looked at her monitor like it held the secrets of the universe, anything to avoid looking at him. Inside the office, through the glass, his desk sat untouched, but the computer was dark. His login had been revoked overnight. Files locked, drawers emptied. His nameplate still clung to the door, but not for long. He knocked once. No one answered. He waited. Then the door opened. It wasn't security. It was Nadine. She stepped aside to let him in, not cold, not angry. Just composed. Professional. A tone that said, we both knew this day would come. Grant stepped inside. He looked at the shelves. Bare. His coffee mug, gone. The framed picture of his old team, removed. His uniform jacket, folded neatly in a box with his name printed in block letters on the lid. What is this? He asked, though he already knew. Nadine didn't answer right away. She sat behind the desk, opened a file, and clicked a pen. The only sound in the room was the pen scratching against paper. She didn't lecture him, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask for his side of the story. She turned one page, drew a single line through a name. His name. "Effective today," she said softly. "Your employment is terminated." Grant swallowed, but still said nothing. Nadine closed the folder, placed her pen on top, then looked him straight in the eye. "No need for a trial," she said. "The people already judged." And she meant it. Not just the press, not just the online fury. She meant the cadets who stopped quoting him, the lieutenants who stopped inviting him to briefings, the clerk who didn't look up when he walked past. They had spoken, not with words, but with distance. He looked around the office one last time, searching, maybe for a glimpse of who he was, or who he thought he was, or who he believed others saw in him. But the room gave nothing back. He picked up the box. It wasn't heavy, just a few things. His badge, a watch, the old notebook he used to carry during field interviews. "That's it," he said, more to himself than to her. "That's it," she replied. No handcuffs, no court date, no spectacle. Just the end of a story he thought he'd always control. He stood there a moment longer, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to say something. "You can go," Nadine said gently. "There's nothing left here for you." And that was the part that broke him. Not the firing, not the public fallout, but that sentence. Soft, final, inevitable. He nodded once, turned, opened the door. No one looked up in the hallway, not a single goodbye, not even a glance. The building didn't echo with his exit. The walls didn't hold their breath. The badge didn't glow or fall. He was just gone. And outside, when he stepped into the morning light, he paused, just for a second, looked back at the station, then down at the box in his hands. There was no anger in his face, just emptiness. The kind that comes when a man realizes he wasn't feared anymore. He was forgotten. In the chief's office, Nadine sat alone for a moment longer. She picked up the same pen, flipped to a clean page, and wrote the first line of a new personnel log. Not as a witness, not as a victim, but as the one who writes the minutes now. The lobby was quiet. Morning light spilled through the high windows, softening the sharp edges of stone and metal. Officers passed through with measured steps. Recruits lined up near the sign-in desk, straightening uniforms, adjusting their name tags, nervous, focused. One of them, young, maybe 20, stood in front of the wooden plaque mounted above the entrance to the training wing. The handwriting was faded, but still strong. Black ink, cursive, written on textured paper behind glass. He read it aloud, barely a whisper. "Justice does not begin with power. It begins with conscience." He didn't know who wrote it, but he stood a little taller after reading it. Behind him, Leticia Torres passed with a clipboard. She gave him a glance, not of correction, but quiet recognition. The kind that says, "You're starting to understand." Outside, Nadine Monroe stepped down the courthouse steps, alone. No cameras, no applause, no headlines, just the sound of her heels tapping against the stone. Steady, certain, and though no one followed her, everyone who saw her walked a little straighter. Not because she ordered them to, but because something in her silence had spoken louder than 100 speeches. The camera lingers for just a moment longer, until the only sound left is the soft, echoing rhythm of justice, walking on its own 2 feet. This story wasn't just about rank or power. It was about conscience, and the quiet courage to stand for what's right. If this moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful, human stories like this. Your support helps us keep creating content that matters. Stories that speak truth, inspire change, and remind us we're not alone. At Mr. Max, we don't just tell stories, we carry them with you.